The Dorvian Empire had conquered 47 star systems in the past century, which was precisely 47 more than most species managed in a millennium. They possessed plasma weapons that could vaporize reinforced bunkers, shield technology that could withstand orbital bombardments, and perhaps most impressively, a military doctrine so refined that lesser species simply surrendered upon seeing their ships arrive. So when the Dorvian Third Expeditionary Force received orders to establish territorial dominance over Forest World ZK-7, Commander Vex Tholian assumed it would be completed before lunch. The planet itself was unremarkable by galactic standards. Nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, acceptable gravity, vast stretches of woodland covering approximately 70% of the landmass. Preliminary scans indicated rich mineral deposits beneath the northern continent, which made the territory valuable enough to claim but not valuable enough to warrant excessive paperwork. Intelligence reports mentioned a small human presence in the region, which prompted exactly zero concern from anyone involved in the planning process. Humans, after all, were the galaxy's favorite joke. They had stumbled onto the interstellar stage barely 2 decades prior, still using combustion-based propulsion and kinetic weapons like absolute savages. Their first diplomatic encounter involved attempting to communicate through interpretive dance because nobody had bothered to teach them about standard translation protocols. They occupied exactly 3 colony worlds, none of which possessed anything resembling proper planetary defense systems. The Dorvian Military Academy used human tactical manuals as examples of what not to do in warfare. Calling them primitive would be generous. Calling them a threat would be comedy. Vex adjusted his tactical visor as the dropships descended through the atmosphere. Beside him, Lieutenant Kresh checked her plasma rifle with the casual boredom of someone assigned to guard a supply closet. The rest of the 50-soldier deployment barely looked up from their datapads. Estimated human presence? Vex asked, already mentally composing his after-action report. Scans indicate 1, possibly 2 individuals in the forest zone, Kresh replied. Heat signatures suggest basic shelter construction, no defensive installations detected, no communications equipment. Commander, this feels excessive for 2 primitives with camping equipment. Vex privately agreed, but orders were orders. The Dorvian Empire claimed territory properly or not at all. We follow protocol. Establish perimeter, issue evacuation notice, secure the zone, standard occupation procedure. The forest, Vex noted as they disembarked, was actually quite pleasant. Towering trees with purple-tinged bark created a canopy that filtered the sunlight into gentle patterns across the moss-covered ground. Native creatures chirped and rustled through the undergrowth. The air smelled of vegetation and soil, and absolutely nothing threatening whatsoever, which made the screaming all the more unexpected. Private decks had been walking point, scanning for obstacles with equipment designed to detect mines, energy signatures, and concealed weapon systems. What it apparently could not detect was a hole covered with branches and leaves, into which decks fell with a yelp that quickly escalated into full-throated shrieking. Vex rushed forward and looked down into the pit. It was 3 meters deep. At the bottom, Dex was impaled on absolutely nothing, because the sharpened wooden stakes had somehow missed every vital organ through what could only be described as malicious precision. The private was stuck, terrified, and thoroughly humiliated, but alive. What in the 7 hells? Kresh stared at the pit. Who digs a hole? With stakes? What is this? The prehistoric era? Vex activated his communicator. Medical team to point position. We have a pit trap situation. A what situation? The medical officer sounded confused. A hole in the ground. With stakes. Just get here. While the medical team extracted Dex from his predicament, Vex reassessed the situation. 1 trap meant nothing. probably an abandoned hunting mechanism from indigenous fauna. Certainly nothing to worry about from a tactical perspective. He ordered the advance to continue with increased caution and absolutely did not think about how their multi-spectrum scanners had failed to detect a literal hole in the ground. The second trap announced itself when Corporal Vesh stepped on a camouflaged pressure plate and got launched 15 meters into the air by a bent sapling. The third trap was a net that dropped from the canopy and left 4 soldiers hanging upside down, weapons clattering uselessly to the ground below. The fourth trap involved a swinging log that clotheslined an entire squad. By the 7th trap, the screaming had become constant background noise. Report. Vex barked into his communicator, trying to maintain some semblance of command, while 3 of his soldiers hopped around trying to remove snares from their ankles. North Team reporting 12 casualties from spike traps, net systems, and 1 incident involving a tree that fell in a direction trees should not naturally fall. East Team has encountered tripwires connected to counterweight systems. Also something involving angry local fauna that may have been deliberately corralled into our path. West Team requests immediate extraction. We have soldiers stuck in mud pits, tangled in vine networks, and 1 individual who somehow got his helmet filled with tree sap. Vex looked at his tactical display, which showed his carefully organized military formation now scattered across the forest, like seeds thrown by a drunken gardener. Every direction showed the same pattern, troops advancing confidently, then sudden chaos markers, appearing as soldiers encountered increasingly absurd obstacles. His 47 system-conquering military force was being systematically destroyed by woodland construction projects. Commander, Kresh approached, her armor covered in mud and leaves. I think someone booby-trapped this entire forest. That is impossible. The resources required, the time investment, the sheer lunacy of... Another scream interrupted him, then another. Then what sounded like multiple soldiers yelling contradictory directions at each other, followed by a loud snapping sound, and more screaming. Vex pulled up the intelligence report on his datapad and read it properly for the first time. Human presence confirmed 6 months ago, single individual. Classification, territorial surveyor. Status, missing, presumed abandoned mission. He looked up at the forest, where his professional soldiers were being systematically humiliated by primitive engineering. Find this human. Marcus Reeve was having an excellent day. He sat in his observation platform, a comfortable wooden structure built into the branches of the largest tree in his territory, watching through binoculars as another group of purple-armored idiots discovered his pride and joy, the cascading pitfall system. 1 soldier would fall into a pit, the counterweight would trigger, which would release a log, which would swing into a tree, which would shake loose a net, which would drop on the soldiers trying to help, and the whole beautiful chain reaction would play out like a symphony of incompetence. Marcus took a bite of roasted local fruit and smiled. 6 months ago, his survey ship had experienced a critical malfunction and dumped him on this planet with nothing but basic supplies and a promise that retrieval would arrive eventually. After 2 weeks of standard survival protocols, Marcus had realized 3 important things. First, this forest was absolutely perfect. Second, he did not particularly want to leave. Third, the galaxy had not filed proper territorial claims on this specific region, which meant, according to human colonial law, he could claim it himself if he established significant permanent presence and defensive capability. Most people interpreted that as building a settlement and maybe a fence. Marcus had interpreted it as turning 40 square kilometers of forest into the world's largest security system. He had started small, basic snares, simple pit traps, the kind of things humans had used since before they invented agriculture. Then he got creative. Counterweight systems borrowed from medieval siege engineering, tripwire networks that would make a spider jealous, false paths that led to actual nightmares involving mud, insects, and strategically placed irritants. He had spent 6 months perfecting his craft, and now the galaxy had sent him test subjects. The Dorvians, bless their overconfident hearts, were performing exactly as expected. Through his binoculars, Marcus watched their commander trying to organize a regrouping. The poor bastard was using logic, trying to map the traps, predict patterns, apply military strategy. Marcus almost felt bad. Almost. But then he remembered these armored jerks had walked into his forest without asking and started acting like they owned the place. Nobody owned this place except Marcus Reeve, and he had the wooden stakes to prove it. He checked his trap status board, a lovingly crafted grid showing which systems had triggered and which remained active. The northern approach was thoroughly saturated. The eastern perimeter had caught about 60% of its targets. The western traps were performing adequately, but could use some refinement. And the southern approach, his masterpiece, remained pristine and waiting. Marcus grinned. They would try the southern approach eventually. They always tried the southern approach because it looked easy. That was the point. Commander Vex Tholian had commanded troops through asteroid field battles, surface sieges, and one memorable incident involving aggressive crystalline lifeforms on a methane moon. Nothing in his extensive military career had prepared him for this absolute nightmare of primitive ingenuity. They had lost 0 soldiers to death, which somehow made it worse. Every trap was designed to injure, humiliate, or inconvenience rather than kill. His troops were covered in mud, tangled in vines, stuck in pits, hanging from trees, and in one inexplicable case, completely wrapped in some kind of sticky plant fiber that the medical team could not remove without industrial solvents. The screaming had evolved from panic to frustration to a kind of resigned despair. "We are the Dorvian 3rd Expeditionary Force," Vex said to himself, staring at his tactical display. "We have plasma weapons. We have shield technology. We have conquered 47 star systems. We also have 16 soldiers currently stuck in what appears to be a giant woven basket," Kresh added helpfully, "hanging from a tree. They cannot figure out how to open it." Vex ignored her. The southern approach shows minimal trap activity. Scans indicate clear paths, stable ground, no obvious snare points. "Commander, if I may, that seems, we are going through the southern approach with overwhelming force. All remaining units, full formation, shields active, weapons ready. We will brute force our way through this ridiculous obstacle course and complete our mission." Vex stood straighter, trying to reclaim some dignity. "These are sticks and holes. We are professional soldiers. This ends now." 20 minutes later, Vex understood what hubris felt like. The southern approach had indeed been clear, suspiciously clear, almost invitingly clear. They had advanced in perfect formation, shields overlapping, scanners on maximum sensitivity. They had detected nothing because there was nothing to detect until they reached the center of the killing zone. Then Marcus activated his masterpiece. The first tree fell from the left, not killed but deliberately weakened and held in place by a rope system. It crashed into the formation, forcing soldiers to scatter. The second tree fell from the right, perpendicular to the first, creating a crude but effective barrier. Then the ground gave way, not into pits, but into a network of trenches covered with flexible material that looked solid but could not support weight. Soldiers dropped into the trenches in groups, landing in knee-deep mud, mixed with something that smelled absolutely horrific. The counterweights triggered next. Vex watched in horror as bent saplings released their tension, launching logs horizontally across the killing zone at chest height. His soldiers ducked, which was exactly what they were supposed to do, which meant they did not see the nets being pulled up from the ground by the same counterweight system. Troops ended up tangled, dragged, or simply overwhelmed by cascading hemp fiber. Then the wildlife arrived. Marcus had spent 3 months studying the local creatures, particularly the 6-legged mammal analogues that became extremely territorial during their mating season. He had carefully corralled approximately 24 of them into a concealed pen near the southern approach, with a release mechanism connected to his trap network. The creatures, annoyed by captivity and confused by sudden freedom, did what territorial animals do when encountering strangers. They attacked everything purple. Vex found himself running through his own soldiers, shields flickering under assault from creatures that should not pose any threat whatsoever, watching his professional military force collapse into complete chaos, because one human had apparently weaponized wildlife, forestry, and basic physics. A log swung past his head. A net dropped on his lieutenant. Something chittered angrily and bit his ankle through his armor somehow. Vex tripped over a root, crashed into a deliberately weakened tree, which fell into another tree, which triggered another counterweight, which released another net, which caught 6 more soldiers. The forest echoed with screaming. Through the chaos, Vex saw him. A human standing on a wooden platform high in a tree, holding what appeared to be binoculars. The human was laughing. Actually laughing at them. Their eyes met across the battlefield of humiliation. The human waved. Vex made the only rational decision available. All units retreat to the ships. Immediate withdrawal. This territory is not worth it. Marcus watched the Dorvian ships lift off with enormous satisfaction. He climbed down from his observation platform and walked through his forest, checking his traps, resetting what could be salvaged, making notes on what needed improvement. The whole system had performed beautifully. Better than expected, really. He reached the southern perimeter, where the main battle had occurred, and surveyed the destruction with a critical eye. Some of the trees would need to be properly felled now. The trenches had performed perfectly, but would need to be dug deeper for future visitors. The wildlife release system had exceeded expectations, though he probably needed better fencing to prevent early activation. From his supply cache, Marcus retrieved a wooden sign he had carved 3 months ago in anticipation of this moment. He had used local wood, treated it properly to resist weather, and carved the letters with the precision of someone with far too much time and determination. The sign read, "Human Territorial Claim, established by Marcus Reeve. Trespassers will be inconvenienced." He planted it firmly in the ground at the forest's main entrance and stepped back to admire his work. 40 square kilometers of woodland, now officially his according to human colonial law. All he needed to do was file the proper paperwork with human authorities, which he would do eventually, once they remembered to retrieve him. Until then, he had traps to maintain. Marcus walked back into his forest, already planning improvements to his defensive network. Maybe something involving the local insects. They were not dangerous but extremely annoying in large numbers. The possibilities were endless, really. Behind him, the sign stood as humanity's first independent territorial claim in this sector. Not through military might or diplomatic negotiation or technological superiority, but through one man's profound attachment to his forest and his absolute willingness to make trespassing the worst decision anyone could make. The galaxy learned about the incident through official military channels approximately 6 hours later. The Dorvian Empire, embarrassed beyond measure, filed their report under strategic withdrawal from contested territory, and absolutely did not mention the 47 soldiers still receiving treatment for trap-related injuries. They updated their territorial charts to mark Forest World ZK-7 as under human control, and strongly advised all ships to avoid the region. Word spread quickly. Other species, curious about how humans had possibly established territorial dominance against a Dorvian military force, sent scout ships to investigate. Most turned back after detecting the heat signatures of approximately 3,000 active mechanical traps scattered throughout the forest. A few brave souls attempted entry and retreated within hours, spreading tales of a death world where the trees themselves fought for the human occupant. The forest gained a reputation. Species whispered about the forest of screaming death, where a single human had repelled trained soldiers using primitive technology, and what military analysts could only describe as a creative spite. Human colonial authorities, baffled by the incident, officially recognized Marcus's territorial claim because legally he had met all the requirements, and also because nobody wanted to be the one to tell him he could not keep his forest. Marcus remained blissfully unaware of his newfound fame. He was too busy perfecting a new trap design involving pulleys, counterweights, and a very large basket of extremely unpleasant plant matter. Some Dorvian commander had looked at him funny, and Marcus held grudges. The galaxy had spent 2 decades underestimating humans, dismissing them as primitive newcomers playing with technology they barely understood. They had forgotten that primitive did not mean stupid, and low-tech did not mean ineffective. They had assumed that species development followed a linear progression, where advanced meant better in all circumstances. They had not considered that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was not the species with plasma weapons and shield generators, but the one that still remembered how to dig a really good hole, and had the spite to dig several thousand of them just to prove a point. Marcus Reeve owned a forest now. He had claimed it properly, defended it successfully, and established humanity's reputation as the species you really should not underestimate, regardless of their technological level. All because someone made the mistake of walking into his territory without asking nicely first. The forest was quiet again, except for the birds and the wind, and the occasional snap of a trap being reset. Somewhere in the trees, a human surveyor hummed to himself while working on his defenses, completely content with his life choices. And in the galactic databases, one small planet gained a single notation: human territory, approach not recommended. It was perhaps the most respectful thing the galaxy had ever said about humanity. They had earned it with sticks, rope, and an impressive commitment to the concept of property rights.